Good evening, everyone. Take,
Hey there, welcome.
I'm not trying to start us early. I just want to make sure everything's working. So,
Good. You hear me okay? Is your
very good.
audio all?
I do.
Hi, go tell.
Hi, Professor Ayers. How are you?
Please call me Ava. Good. How are you?
Thank you, Ava. With your blessing, I will do so. As an alum, it's hard to call your. Well, he wasn't a former professor of mine, but still, it's hard to do the first name basis as an alum.
I know. I know what you mean.
Thank you for being so gracious. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good
Glad
evening.
to be here. Glad for the
Good evening,
invite.
everyone.
Hi, John Raphael.
Hey, Ava.
All right. Just finishing up my snacks.
Yes.
Welcome to everybody who's here. We're going to get started in just a minute, but I'm going to give it just another minute or two for folks to join. Okay, greetings everybody. It's 6:02, so I think we should get started. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this roundtable on Executive Order 203 and the challenges that municipalities face in implementing it. I want to say, first of all, that we are recording this session. Our plan is to make the recording available on request, but not to post it anywhere online. So that we can have a happy medium between candid conversation and still allowing folks who can't be here but want to see the conversation to watch it later. I want to say a few things about how I'm hoping this conversation will proceed and what the goals are. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Ava Ayers. I am a professor at Albany Law School, where I'm also the director of the Government Law Center. And the Government Law Center is sort of like a small think tank attached to the law school. I'm happy to see our legal director, Richard Rifkin, and some of our law student interns, Matt DeLoss and Ruchi Patel, are here. We also have Melody Harkness. Melody is one of my colleagues at the Government Law Center who also staffs the Albany Community Police Review Board. So we have a contract with the city of Albany to essentially staff their review board for them. And so I've been working closely, as some of you here know, with some of the folks involved in Albany's 203 implementation process. I've also been having conversations with folks in a bunch of different municipalities about their 203 implementation process. And I'm excited to bring folks together here. The idea really is that we can hopefully share thoughts and questions, things that are going on in different municipalities, because the single biggest question I've heard from people in different municipalities is there any way we can compare notes with people in other places to find out what they're doing? Are we ahead? Are we behind? Are we missing things? Does anybody else's process look like ours? And so I'm hoping to encourage you all to talk to each other. I want to say just a few words by way of introducing the topic of 203, because obviously there's a lot of things we could talk about. The governor has created an executive order that really opens up everything. Reinvent policing and reimagine policing is a number of topics that probably exceeds anything we could cover here in a single evening. So I want to just run through a little bit, some framework questions, and then I'll invite all of you. Some folks have already submitted questions that they were thinking would be good for discussion by email. You're certainly welcome to do that. You're also welcome to submit ideas through the chat function. If you're familiar with Zoom, you know that wiggling your mouse around this screen that you see in front of you brings up a little bar with the word chat on it. And if you click on that word chat, you then see something that looks like a big text thread, and you can put your thoughts in there. I will try to look at the chat. If it gets too overwhelming, I may get lost. But I'll also ask folks, I'll invite people to suggest topics or questions in just a minute. So you'll also be able to do that out loud. All right, a couple of words about the executive order and some resources for it. As I'm sure you all know, the executive order directs municipalities to reimagine policing and produce and approve, or at least take action on a plan by April 1st. An important resource here, which I think everybody should have in mind, and I'm going to just share my screen real quick, is the guidance document that the governor's office issued, which I can put a link to in chat, although I know folks working on this in the municipalities are largely very, very familiar with this. Appendix B, which is on page 125 of the PDF, is a list of what folks in the municipalities are supposed to certify at the end of the process. So this is the form that has to be emailed on April 1st. This is what folks need to attest that they've done. And by folks, I mean whoever identifies themselves as the chief executive of the local government, which I think most local governments know who that is: the mayor, the town supervisor, presumably the county executive. And then there are 5 things that one is supposed to certify in this order. First, that the local government has performed a comprehensive review of current police force deployments, strategies, policies, procedures, and practices, which, as far as I can think, covers literally everything about a police force. I can't imagine anything that's not included in that. So a comprehensive review of everything. Right, like All Things Considered, the talk show when you're driving. Okay, the local government has developed a plan, and the plan has to be attached to the certification to improve such deployments, strategies, policies, procedures, and practices. So this is important. I've been on a conference call with the governor's office. Maybe some of you were on it as well, where the governor's office emphasized that even if you're already doing great stuff, even if your police department adopted a whole bunch of reforms in 2019 and you're very proud of them, this executive order requires you to go through a process and develop a new plan, a plan that has change in it, or at least that's how I understood. I don't speak for the governor's office, obviously. I work for Albany Law School. The governor is an alum. I've not talked to him. I'm not here on his behalf. So I don't know what he's thinking, but my sense was, we want change. We want community consultation and new ideas. The third big prong says the local government has consulted with stakeholders, and then it has a list in parentheses, including, so it has to include, but is not limited to, the police force. We've had several conversations about this in Albany. The police are part of the stakeholders who get consulted here. Members of the community, with emphasis in areas with high numbers of police and high numbers of community interactions, as well as interested nonprofit and faith-based community groups, the local office of the district attorney, the local public defender, and local elected officials. And the local government has offered the plan in draft form for public comment to all citizens in the locality. And prior to adoption of the plan by the local legislative body, has considered the comments submitted. So there has to be public notice and comment before the local legislature takes action. And then finally, the legislative body of the local government has ratified or adopted the plan by local law or resolution. And so, it's not totally clear from this text what ratified or adopted means. The plan is submitted, and we've had some conversation about this in Albany about exactly what it means to ratify or adopt the plan in terms of, does that mean there is specific implementing legislation that's been crafted, or is it enough that the plan includes policy ideas? And my sense is that the governor's office does want real change, but the different localities may come up with different senses of what that means. And I think it's important to note that this is all procedural, right? That the procedural requirements here are very strong. Comprehensive review, developed a plan, consulted with all these stakeholders, public comment. This is a very intensive procedural set of requirements, but it doesn't say anything about what needs to be in the plan, not in the certification. The governor's office guidance, as I'm sure many of you know, does have a list of topics, and I know some jurisdictions have organized their task forces. A lot of places are calling them collaboratives or working groups, whatever. A lot of them are organized to follow the table of contents of the governor's office guidance, which has one question: what functions should the police reform? Which refers to the set of issues that many people carefully avoid calling defund the police, meaning, but people are more likely to refer to as reallocating police functions. Who should respond to emergencies, that kind of thing. The second section is employing smart and effective policing standards and strategies, which is both policing tactics and specifically reducing racial disparities and building community engagement and trust. And there's this third category, fostering community-oriented leadership, culture, and accountability, which includes transparency, obviously a huge issue that a lot of police departments were already engaging with because of the repeal of Civil Rights Law 50A, so that now police disciplinary records are available to the public, as well as accountability. And so, I know of at least one jurisdiction that is planning to create a civilian police review board, several other jurisdictions that are thinking about that. And I want to say by way of footnote that if there are issues that any of the folks on the call are thinking about, and you'd be interested in sort of learning more about Albany's experience or about the Government Law Center's research, please feel free to send us an email and I'll be happy to talk to you about that. If I can be helpful, I'd love to. And the final category in the governor's office guidance is recruiting and supporting excellent personnel. And I get a lot of questions about, does anybody have any good ideas for recruiting a more diverse police force? And I wish I could tell you that I had come across brilliant ideas other than spend a lot of more time and energy on it. But so far, that's been my experience. So I wanted to put all that up because I think it's helpful to be reminded of what those are. I from some of the folks who are here, I know that we have a mix of some folks who are part of the municipalities and some folks who are community members who've been working with their municipalities. I think that's great. And, I know that sometimes I talk to folks in communities who are saying, my municipality isn't doing anything. How do I get them to pay attention? And sometimes I have meetings with municipalities where they say, how do we get a better community response? I'm happy to share, to have you all share whatever thoughts and perspectives you have. So let me, at this point, let me just share one thing in the chat generally, and we'll send this out again to all the people who registered. But what I just put in the chat is a link to the place where the Government Law Center has collected draft plans from various municipalities. It's a spreadsheet. We'll be updating it as we see more draft plans go up online. So if you're interested, please feel free to take a look at that. Hang on one second, my daughter has a question. Okay, sorry about that, parenting. Let me open up the floor then. So what I want to do is, I said I wanted to encourage you to talk to each other, to share thoughts, questions, concerns, issues. What I'd like to do is sort of invite folks to just share. We're going to do a first pass, just share what topics you'd like to hear from other people about. And then once I gather a list of what topics people think they'd like to hear from other people about, then I'll try to invite people to respond. So if this is okay, what I'd like to do first is invite just what are the topics? What do you want to hear from other people from other jurisdictions, other municipalities about? Oh, this is great. I already see stuff coming through the comments. This is wonderful through the chat. Yeah, and let me see. I'm going to. Oh, I forgot. Sorry. Our crack security system is now going to allow you to unmute yourself. So, William, I think you were first. Mr. Key, go ahead. Let me see if I can. Didn't work? Let me see if I can unmute you.
How about now? That
Great.
good?
Absolutely.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I would like to hear more of what has the different municipalities done so far as engaging the community and engaging the labor force in the different communities. In Long Island, I'll say real quickly that in Suffolk County, we have had 9 to 10 meetings with the different police forces throughout Suffolk County with the government representatives. And it was solely to really listen to the community members. And it was pretty good. So I'd just like to hear those experiences from others.
Okay, great. All right, I see Gabriela Romero. Oh, sorry, it looks like, sorry, I thought I had given people the power. Are you good now? Okay.
I think I'm good. Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriela Romero. I'm an attorney in the Albany County Public Defender's Office, and I am on the Bethlehem Police Reform Committee. I have specific questions for other people that are on other police reform committees about their reformation of the use of force policies. I'd like to kind of work on, specifically in Bethlehem, creating a really comprehensive description of force and the different measures going up in the ability to use force, and outlining that specifically. We have something planned, but I'd like to collaborate with other groups on what they're doing with that. And then I also have a question about if anyone else is trying to implement a police review board and the backlash that they might be getting from the police force about the ability to discipline police officers if they find that there has been some issue with the complaint against the police officer. I know Albany, I've been really following the Albany discussion and the Rochester litigation, but I'm curious of the other smaller municipalities like Bethlehem. We're encountering a lot of problems and a lot of pushback with the police force about how we're gonna do this. And I find myself saying, well, Albany is doing it, so we should be looking into it too. Like if they're implementing these wonderful ideas, we should also follow suit. And I'm curious if anyone's feeling that as well. And I'm in another group about reforming the policies within the police department. And I thought the use of force was something that obviously needs to be clarified, but I'm curious if anyone else in any other subgroups have specific police policies that they would like to reform.
Great. Wow, this is amazing. I've got so many wonderful questions and issues in the chat. So here's how I'm dividing them up. I'm dividing them up into questions about the process, that is the 203 process, and then questions about what sorts of specific reforms people are have in mind. And I see a lot of great questions about both of those things. Within reforms, I'm going to try to divide them up roughly into in the same way the governor's office seems to divide them up in their order. But let's start with the process, because I think that may lead into discussions about some of these other issues. So I've got a couple of questions about process, and what I'm going to do, I think, is invite folks to speak to them. I suspect people are going to have a lot of thoughts on these, and I want to say that I'm planning to stay as long as you want, as long as it's not after 8 o'clock, because after 8 o'clock, I turn into a pumpkin and sort of officially a bad parent. So let's see. Yeah, I see one more question from Julie Shapiro, according to your text.
Hi, I'm Bill Shapiro. My wife, Julie is my screen name. I want to go back to the question that Steve Gottlieb raised in his email, which is not about process, but which is about how do you leverage change within police departments. I had mailed in one suggestion, but I hope we get a chance to discuss ways we can provide incentives for police leadership and police departments to actually not only subscribe to, but actually live by some of the changes that are proposed in the plans.
Yeah, I think that's great. So if I have it right, your email, which I thought was great, was about the cost of lawsuits and settled lawsuits in particular. I'm talking about would the world be different if settled lawsuits came out of the police department's budget rather than the municipality's budget?
It's a nerdy suggestion, but
Yeah.
but it goes directly to incentives. The question is whether when a city is making its budget, if the cost of the settlements is a charge on the department's budget, so it has to compete with other priorities. Might that provide incentives for all the kinds of things you would like to see in recruitment and training and supervision and policy setting?
All right, so here's where I want to start, because these are great. Let's start with the questions about getting documents that you need for the 203 process. I think that's a good place to get started. And there were a couple of questions about that. So there was one about getting documents from the comptroller in your area, about getting budgetary documents. There was another question about, I'm familiar with some municipalities where it hasn't been easy to get policy documents from the police department to understand the current policies. So does anybody want to speak to their experience trying to get the documents that they feel that their task force, I'm going to call them task forces for short. If you call yours a collaborative or working group, bear with me, but let's just agree on a shorthand. I'm going to go with task force, the group of community stakeholders, whoever they are. Does anybody have thoughts or useful experiences on getting information that they need from their municipality? Has that been an obstacle? Has that not been an obstacle? I believe I've now given you all the power to unmute yourself. If I'm wrong, please, wave frantically and act like a mime, and I'll know.
Hi, my name is Susan Goderer. I'm the director of NICLU in Nassau County, and Nassau County Jail Advocates and a couple of others. In Nassau County, they barely collect any data, so they can't report any data, and that's part of our reform plan. So just our experiences, and they don't have centralized databases. They have 4 different platforms, 2 are old, 2 are new. We're having trouble getting information through FOIL, and the task forces that were formed, I'm going to use air quotes, it was a total farce. And when the task force that was designated as the data collecting task force was asking for data, they couldn't get any. So I know that there are frustrations around the state. We have chapter directors all around the state, so I know a little bit of what's going on in the Hudson Valley and other areas, and I know that that's a problem as far as the actual process goes. So
interesting. So one question wrapped up in that is, have folks had to use the Freedom of Information law to try to get information, or has this been approached in a more collaborative way? I see Connor's laughing at that question.
Hi, yes, this is Judith Montalban from LIPA, and I did use the, how are you today? I did use the Freedom of Information Act to request fiscal documents like budget, overtime expenditures, and how are they earmarking their federal and state grants. Suffolk County complied, Nassau County hasn't complied.
Interesting, wow.
Good evening. This is Bob Fleury, the small community of Guilderland near Albany. I have not experienced any difficulty obtaining any documents. In fact, our police chief sat with most of the committees, subcommittees that were formed, and our police chief made available the entire index of policies that are written and followed within the Guilderland Police Department, including one that was of particular interest to me, the use of force policy. So we've had that information made readily available to us, at least with respect to the question of the policies that are generated and used within the police department.
This is also Julie Carasone. I represent Genesee County, all the way out here in Western New York. We have not experienced those issues as well. Our sheriff and our undersheriff has been very open with the data that they do have, such as use of force. They've been very open with us as how many times that they have used it, how many times that they have used a gun, and all of their procedures. What we have found out was there hasn't been any data collected on what type of calls that they go on, from mental health to substance use disorders, if they're going to a robbery or anything of that nature. So we found that out in our findings, and we have made a recommendation that we start collecting that data so that we know what type of calls that they are attending to, so we can, if there needs to be a focus on mental health issues, then we can put our fiscal money, we can put our training for mental health and for trauma-informed care towards those issues. Great.
And I will add, I'm glad to hear that Guilderland is doing well, since I'm speaking to you from Guilderland right now. I happen to be a resident, and I think that, you know, some of the municipalities have actually hired outside firms to do an audit of their racial justice practice. I know Guilderland, or I'm sorry, not Guilderland, Niskayuna has retained somebody to do this. And often what those auditors find is that they have suggestions about what kind of data should be collected in the future. So if the groups themselves are finding that they can't get information, that's a great subject for a recommendation. And a recommendation that could be directed to the state legislature as well, in terms of what information should be made public in the future. So what about, in terms of the other process question that came up, which I love, I think Terry Diggory raised in the comments. To what extent are folks planning to make recommendations that will take effect, you know, immediately, versus sort of saying, look, we need to improve this kind of thing, whatever it is. Our recommendations may, you know, we're going to try to create structures for the future, or we're going to have proposals for the future. And that's, you know, but this plan will carry on into the future. Terry, does that fairly capture what you were thinking about? So I'm Okay, great. Well, so for anybody who wants to jump in, what sorts of effect, when the recommendations that you're thinking of making, when will they take effect? Are they now recommendations or later recommendations, or let's form a blue ribbon commission recommendations, or someone should do something about a problem recommendations? What sorts of things are you all contemplating?
If I could just elaborate a little bit on my
Yeah.
question, in Saratoga Springs, where I am, we're coming up with a pretty robust set of recommendations, and we've been telling ourselves that a lot of these things need to be projected into the future, and I actually see some danger if we insist that everything simply be an up or down, yes, we adopt this, no, we don't, by April 1st, that a city council or whatever the municipal body is might resist that and say, well, no, we can't process this. We're going to say no. Whereas if there's a way of saying, okay, the next stage is to refer some of this to a committee to do some other further type of review, at least that gives more time for assimilating what could be a very complex set of recommendations.
Yeah. Other folks' thoughts on that issue?
This is Shannon Wong, and I'm a chapter director similar to Susan in the Hudson Valley with the New York Civil Liberties Union, and I use she, her pronouns. I just wanted to say that in some communities, there were already advocates on the ground that were doing work, and they passed stuff over the summer that really was pushed forward because of the uprising and all the protests that occurred. And those were pretty easy lifts. A lot of police identification bills where a police officer would be required to identify themselves, share the reason for a stop, and provide a business card. Those seem to be easy lifts and were passed before this process. In one community in Kingston, they created sort of a more robust, transparent process for their police commission, not subpoena power or disciplinary power, but sort of training and accountability and transparency, sort of a first step. And in other communities, I feel like there's a lot of work around use of force. Gabriella, I'd love to talk a little bit about that. I can't directly chat you. But I feel like those are going to be policy changes that are going to occur. Most municipalities that I've seen are going to have looked into putting in a duty to intervene, a duty to render medical aid, not shooting at a moving vehicle. And I expect those will happen before the end of the, relatively quickly after April.
Sorry, my dog has thoughts. Yeah, I think a lot of communities are finding that there are some things that are sort of low-hanging fruit. There's some reforms that are relatively easy to adopt. A requirement that all police department policies be posted online seems like a sort of basic thing. Whereas unarmed first responders and who those people should be requires a lot more structural work in some places to figure out. So I guess let me put the question to the group this way. Has anybody found a way to approach this question when there's a big topic like unarmed responders, where it's harder for the group to coalesce around a solution or to even figure out who needs to be involved in that solution? Has anybody found a way to feel confident that they're going to keep that conversation going, that they're going to continue making progress on that after April 1st? What do you do with those big issues you don't quite know how to solve yet? Does anybody have a...
Could I just add something?
Of course.
Oh,
please go ahead.
I am not a part of a task force, but I sort of play the role of a sort of a watchdog of this whole process, and wondering if there are any other groups like, I'm from the Center for Law and Justice in Albany, and we've been involved with criminal justice issues for this is our 36th year going on, 36th year. So we know a lot about the police department and policing, and we've been through everything. And we're sort of worried about where everything is going. because we're not, as I said, we're not officially a part of the process, but we want to know what's going to be happening afterwards, what's going to be happening when these plans are sent to the governor, and who's going to pick up the pieces, because we've always had to do that. And so we're concerned about those issues of what's, what are the immediate issues that are going to be addressed, and what are the long-term ones, and how does the rest of the community fit into this? That's the other piece of this, because since we're not officially a part of the task force, where does the community fit into all of this? And we're really concerned about that, because in Albany, as I said last night at a meeting, we don't see a plan. For us, a plan maybe means something very different than what I hear all of you talking about. For us, we want to see something that tells us that we really have reinvented policing, that the things that all the recommendations, all of the actions that have been taken, have they really addressed the major issues like systemic racism and all of that? And we're just not seeing that. And so I'm just wondering if some of the other people outside of Albany might have thought about this and how to address it. But we're really concerned because, as I said, we've been involved in this change business for so long. And for us, this is the moment when we can be thinking about, real change that we haven't seen in the past.
Hi, this is Sandra Dunn from, I'm on the East Hampton task force, to use your terminology, we call it something different. And this on the far east end of Long Island. So, small municipalities, not a large city like Albany or Rochester or anything. But what Alice is saying is also a concern that I have. And we have talked about in our committee meetings, we have spent some time talking about kind of the murkiness of and the mystery surrounding what happens once the plan is submitted. What happens way up there at the state level, and what, there's no indication of what implementation will look like, what the governor, et cetera, will do, et cetera. So there's that murkiness. So our committee has said, well, we kind of don't care what they do up there. We care, but if they don't do anything, as the government is wont to do, then we're going to make sure that here locally, we have something in place that makes sure that these things happen. So we haven't figured out what that is yet, whether it's going to be periodic citizen reviews or, the committee reconvening twice a year or whatever it might be. We haven't sorted that out. But to Alice's point, we also have that concern that, that what happens with this, and what you were saying too, Alice, about the plan, it seems like such a misnomer, at least as far as I can tell from our own process here, because it seems like, yes, we come up with a set of recommendations, but not necessarily a very detailed plan on how to implement those recommendations. So when I think plan, I think, okay, what's the plan for implementation? But it seems that this process is not really calling for that. At least that's how most of the people on our committee are understanding it. It's like, okay, well, we submit some recommendations. So.
And I didn't mean to suggest that, because we do have a watchdog function here, the center has been very involved from the very beginning of this whole process. I have a mountain of ideas, recommendations, suggestions that we have given to the collaborative. I don't know if they're taking them seriously or not, but we've been involved. But as I said, it is murky. If the governor looks at all the plans that you're going to present, and if they all sort of look alike, like you got all these recommendations, is the governor going to just say, okay, you've done the job? And then we're left saying, wow, we thought this was going to really bring about change. But we don't know what the governor's going to say. We don't know what the plan's going to look like. And, you know, we're in the community. We're the ones who suffer the most. And yet we don't know what is coming out of all of this. So they have some great concerns about the process and what we're going to end up with.
Yeah, so this is great. I have William Key and then Connor Reynolds, and I just want to say there's some great comments in the chat from people talking about how their plans include empowering specific entities to keep taking action in the future, whether it's the sort of whatever the task force or collaborative is itself staying in power, or giving that to a community police oversight entity. And I think those ideas are great. Personally, I want to sort of agree with Alice that it's really important that the community be involved in those entities going forward, and that whatever that is be inclusive. But William, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'm going to be brief because what Alice and Sandra just spoke about, it really hits the nail right on the head as far as the apprehension of, well, what is this actually going to wind up being? Do we have a finger, a hand, a foot in this, or are we just being pacified? And you know, without repeating what they said, they hit the nail on the head that there is great concern about where we land with this after the task forces meet, the suggestions are given. Where do we actually land, and how much does the community actually have an authority when they make these suggestions? On the flip side of that, I've heard a couple of comments from folks on the line that seems to be very pleasing in certain areas where there are things that have started already and are in motion back as far as the in the middle of the summer. So that is good if there some of the communities have already taken steps. I think that's positive, and I think if you chart out and start chopping the places where there are issues that are being dealt with, it has to be a little more public for the successes that are out there, so that we can all grow and learn from them.
Great, thank you. Connor.
Hey everybody, I'm Connor Dwyer Reynolds. I'm the Executive Director of Rochester's Police Accountability Board. I, along with our chair, Shawnee Wilson, served on Rochester's Executive Order Task Force. I have so much I can say, so many stories, but I want to focus on some questions people have been having about implementation. From day one, our Police Accountability Board has been very open-eyed and realistic about this whole process. It's essentially an unfunded mandate that has to be done in a very limited amount of time. So you don't have really the resources to do the work that you have to do. There's not a requirement that the whole community be at the table. And so, we kind of set our expectations appropriately for this process. What we thought about, though, because we have a statutory mission to review and recommend policies for the Rochester Police Department and engage the community in creating those recommendations. So we are tasked locally with the long-term work of what this executive order is supposed to do. So our thinking was this could be a jump start on our work. So we invested a ton of time, just the Police Accountability Board took this assignment and said, let's use this time to listen to the community, be extremely transparent, and figure out, are there really super pressing things the community want? And let's try and get extremely concrete recommendations with clear funding mandates and deadlines into this plan. So we created a 100-page set of recommendations. We issued draft recommendations to the public, had a bunch of feedback sessions to listen from the public and individual groups. We got over 30 single-spaced pages of responses from the community, translated that into final recommendations, and then submitted that to the working group. If you compare the recommendations we submitted to the ones in the working group, you'll see a radical difference. The plan that Rochester came out with, and before I continue speaking, I just want to clarify, I'm speaking in my personal capacity here, not on behalf of the board. My opinions are my own. I know we've got a lot of fantastic people from Rochester on this call who are great people. I'm glad you're here, and I just want to make clear that this is my thoughts on this process, not the Police Accountability Board's. Every single one of our recommendations used legal language. By the end of 2021, the city shall invest $10 million in this specific program. Within 90 days of passing this plan, the city shall partner with this specific organization to create a new language access plan, over and over and over again. The final plan takes some of our recommendations, strips out the implementation deadline, strips out the funding requirements, and often strips out any shall or must language, right? Now you can see this as a kind of a failure on behalf of the Police Accountability Board. But part of our process was communicating clearly to stakeholders. Here's your feedback to the Police Accountability Board. Here's the specific recommendation that feedback resulted in. This is a clear change that you wanted. You should check if this is in the plan. And for the most part, those recommendations are not in the plan. And so what we've done is tried to use this process as a way to create community conversations and implementation structures so that other community groups who may not have been part of this process can start holding elected officials accountable, because they have participated in an open, transparent process with at least the Police Accountability Board. And hopefully that will allow them to see the potential for long-term change that an institution like ours could change. Now, I know so many communities do not have a Police Accountability Board dedicated to long-term change. And so my only recommendation is that if there's one thing you can try and put in your plan, and I've seen this a lot in the chat, is clear fundamental investments in institutions that are committed to long-term community-driven change. Because I think we can be realistic about what this executive order process will get out of it. But if there's one thing we can get, it is the institutions to get the kind of change we actually need at the community level. So I'll stop talking there, but I'm happy to talk more about transparency in the Rochester process, about how that we, I think Alice talked a lot about concerns about process. I got a lot of them. And I'm happy to share my thoughts on that, but I'll be quiet for now because there's so many voices I want to hear.
So just before we jump to something else, hi, it's Sandra again. Connor, that was super helpful, thank you. But what you were saying at the very end, so recognizing that most of us don't have a PAB. So what were you saying about putting into the plan? I'm taking notes. What were you saying about putting into the plan institutions? What were you saying about institutions, and what institutions do you have in mind?
So a few things. So I'll just go back to the Rochester PAB's recommendations. We recommended that the city provide financial and organizational support to a coalition of community groups that would be committed to creating and implementing a long-term plan to reimagine Rochester's basic policing blueprint, right? We asked for money. We asked for it to happen in the next year. We also asked for the city to fund and support a people's budgeting process led by those community groups. Finally, we asked for the city to provide full funding to the existing institutions committed to change, including the Rochester Police Accountability Board. So those were the very specific asks that we're talking about for that institutional and foundational work. I will also say that none of those recommendations are in the plan. There is no funding or commitment or anything to those institutions. So.
If you all are looking for ammunition for arguments about the need to fund institutions in your communities, Connor has a dynamite PowerPoint presentation that shows other cities, granted some of them are on the West Coast where they do all kinds of who knows what, but and how much they spend per police officer on accountability oversight, and that might help you make your pitch. But let me say, I want to make sure to cover everyone's questions to the greatest extent possible. And so the next question I have on my list is related to something that's come up in the chat and that a couple of folks have asked about. Susan, I think it was you who said in the chat, and I loved this framing, that the executive order sort of limits the scope, as broad as it is, it limits the scope of things maybe a bit artificially by talking about police rather than by talking about public safety. And I know Alice has, one of the things that the Center for Law and Justice, which Alice Green represents, has proposed is that in Albany, we should have a Department of Public Safety, and the police should be only one branch of that there should be other entities within the, and Alice, you please correct me if I'm summarizing this wrong, but that, it's not just police. Public safety is more than just police, and we need other actors within the city who are professional, who are tasked with public safety that are not armed police responders. And I'm really interested in hearing, this whole sort of reimagining police. First thing I think of when I hear that is reimagining what police do and finding somebody else to do it. And I think in a lot of communities, that's such a big conversation and a difficult conversation, and a conversation that probably involves collaborating with your county or intermunicipal agreements to actually procure these services, if you're not a city that has resources, and maybe even if you are. So I'm very interested to hear from anybody sort of, how are you responding to that problem that Susan identifies about sort of, it's more than just police, it's public safety in general, and that we need to be having a conversation about.
Right, we agree with that. We've got to get rid of policing. That term has such terrible implications. Because it goes back for us. It's part of the enslavement period, and it's militaristic. It's all of that stuff. We don't need to be calling people who do law enforcement police. And if we're going to deal with this issue of distrust with the police department, there's no reason why we have to be calling it a police department. So we're sort of focusing on that. And I agree, we're talking about public safety. So, there are others in the community who can do a lot of those, carry out a lot of the functions that our police department is now carrying out. And I think a number of people have suggested that. But I think, if we're really going to reimagine, policing, if you want to call it, we've got to really be bold. And if we're not going to be bold, I'm just hearing the same thing that I've heard for 36 years, and so we have, we're very, very, very concerned about continuing that whole history of policing, particularly in communities of color. We don't need it.
Yeah, I mean, I can just add that the police commissioner put out a report in Nassau County based on that checklist. And it's just, even the back checklist that the county executive has to sign off on, it's not okay. Because then they get away with just sticking to, I reviewed policies and procedures and we kept it within the framework of policing. And so the executive order itself is framed in a way that blocks out other ways of thinking and other ways of doing things. So we just kind of said, because the process was so bad in Nassau County, that we're just going to put out our own plan, and it has all the components of alternatives to policing, unarmed traffic departments, for traffic stops and things like that. So that's how we're getting around it. And the wording of everything in our plan is geared towards the idea of public safety. There's the prologue in it is going to be about the history of policing and the controlling of Black bodies and all of that stuff. So we're kind of using it as a teaching, where if you can teach, you should teach. It's going to be a public document. So that's how we're going about it. We'll see. We haven't introduced it yet, so it'll be coming out in about a week. The police commissioner, if you go on the site that you guys have at the Albany Law School, the link for Nassau County, that's an example of a police commissioner writing his own reform. So if you go into Nassau County and click on the link, that is not the real plan. Just letting you know. We will send you the real plan when it's introduced.
It's interesting. You probably saw we have a separate space on the spreadsheet to make sure that we can have multiple different documents, because it's true that in some places there are different entities that are doing their own. And I just want to say, because I think, like I said before, I don't speak for the governor's office or even speak to them very much, but I can read what they say. And despite the way the executive order is written, the guidance that they issued is not at all ambiguous. One of the questions communities are supposed to answer is, can your community reduce violence more effectively by redeploying resources from policing to other programs? And should you deploy social service personnel instead of, or in addition to, police officers in some situations? So, the governor's office expects people to engage with that question. Now, as folks were saying, who knows what'll happen on April 1st when they get these plans? They're going to put them into a bowl with some chicken bones and hold it up to the light, and see what the spirits tell them about whether they're going to withhold funding from the municipality. But it is clear that they do want folks to engage with that question. And well, let me just say, I don't see anybody else raising their hand to speak to that particular one, which is fine. Oh, Clotel, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I wanted to ask about the funding component that I know many people have kind of touched on with, putting the plans together. And I was just curious if there's been any known interface with members of Congress in light of the fact that last year a very robust police reform bill, passed the House. We know what happened with it in the Senate, but it very well could be taken up again in this session of Congress. And it does provide for funding through grant programs, et cetera. So I was just curious as to what the interface has been and putting plans together and having a dialogue with representation through Congress in terms of getting monies down the road and just getting ahead of what we know a funding issue and a fight's going to be. Anyone can talk about that, I would love to hear. Sounds like there hasn't been any.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, really has because in Albany, the task force was very much sort of separated from the Common Council, which controls budgeting. So we were not budgeting for these recommendations. We weren't engaged with that process. And so, now it's arriving at the Common Council, who's looking at it and being like, okay, like, where's the money going to come from? Has anybody been able to engage with the budgeting process along the of their task force?
So NYCLU put together a like a defund toolkit for folks so that community members could understand how to review their budgets and how to look at how much is spent on policing and versus how much is spent on what's true community safety. And I'm looking for it, and I can put it in the chat. Some communities used it. Some communities produced graphics. Kingston, again, and Poughkeepsie, which is where I do most of my work, had graphics that they presented and said to the community members and city council members, like, look how much you're spending on the police versus things that really can promote true community safety. And I'll put that in the chat for you all.
Great,
I think Beacon, New York also did something like that, looking at the cost of all of the functions that don't really need to be part of law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let me, well, I mean, folks, look, you probably gathered, I'm trying to be fairly casual about all this. So if folks want to return to issues, you can do that. I've got a couple of more things that I know people were really interested in talking about. Let's talk about use of force and Gabriella's question. It came up in the chat as well. Specific reforms. I find this particularly difficult because I came into our process. I'm an appellate lawyer. I know about government. I don't know anything about police tactics. So how does one, as a member of these task forces or collaboratives, what kinds of things are you suggesting on use of force? What kinds of things are people struggling with? And Gabriella, if you want to say anything else about your question, please feel free.
I offered input in the town of Guilderland on the use of force policy, and not to denigrate the policy that exists within the town of Guilderland, but as an example to express my thinking. The town of Guilderland's use of force policy is a 19-page document. There are 3 places within that document that mention in only a few words the concepts of de-escalation, crisis intervention, negotiation, and conflict resolution. So my input, I advocated very strongly that the use of force policy should be revised to bring to the fore the concepts of de-escalation, conflict resolution, crisis intervention, and make that a significant and central part of the policy, as opposed to having it be treated in a minimalist way. As a result, our recommendations in Guilderland have included with consent and consensus built within the police department, at least at their executive level. More emphasis on training to include specific categories within the police department training program for de-escalation strategies and techniques, for conflict resolution. And I believe we have a commitment from the police department to engage in an ongoing, perhaps periodic, but nonetheless ongoing review of the use of force policy. Parenthetically, in the limited amount of research I did, it seems to me that most of our municipalities are using virtually the same use of force policy, which has been through the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, if not handed out, at least provided as a kind of an document. I'd be surprised if there's a great in use of force policies. But in any event, my input was to that policy to make it reflect a community held value that one of our primary focal points in use of force should be de-escalation. Don't bring a gun to a situation thinking that you might have to use it. Bring to that situation the concepts of, I need to de-escalate this. I need to ensure, to the degree that I can, safety concerns taken into account, that this incident is resolved without violence.
I see somebody in the chat who's only appearing as iPhone says they have a comment about use of force policies. So iPhone, feel free to go ahead if you can.
Sure, this is Vanessa Baird Streeter. Can you hear me?
Great, yep, absolutely.
Good. I serve as the co-facilitator of Suffolk County, Long Island's police reform and reinvention. So as it pertains to de-escalation, the gentleman that spoke before me is correct that most police departments are using the DCJS use of force. However, Suffolk County does add on additional hours, probably an additional 11 hours focused on de-escalation. So we have been able to, as task force members, we have been able to review the de-escalation policies and procedures and what's taught in the academy. However, even though it does exist, there is also opportunity, there exists opportunity to be able to improve that. So we've looked at PERF's ICAT training, and we are looking at implementing and instituting and infusing PERF's ICAT training as it pertains to de-escalation as part of our recommendations. And the police department, of course, is on board. It actually came from the police commissioner. So I would suggest for those who are looking at this and may not have come up with an opportunity for additional engagement or additional resource, that the PERF ICAT training is considered to be a very substantive training that is a particular focus on de-escalation. And I would just suggest people take an opportunity to look at it, and it could be something that's added to the module as it pertains to use of force and de-escalation and professional communication policies and procedures.
What is I'm not familiar with the acronym that you're using. PERF ICAT, you're saying?
Yeah, so ICAT is the type of training. PERF is the Police Executive Reform. I don't know what the F is for. So
Police
if you
Executive Research Forum.
Yes, thank you. So if you look up their training, that is something where we said that they have another way of looking at de-escalation and professional communications, and it's an opportunity for us to be able to take that opportunity to infuse it in as part of our training.
One of the things our analysis in looking at use of force policy pointed up another problem, and that is clarity of the language. For instance, chokeholds. No one could actually interpret what the language of it. The union said it already exists when others were calling for, language that would prohibit chokehold. the union said it already exists, it's already there, and and others said it wasn't. And there's not, if you look at the language, you can't tell what is prohibited. And so we've been sort of looking at those kinds of things because it's not clear. When people think they can, something is prohibited and it's not, and which causes another problem.
Yeah, and related to that, I saw a comment in the chat that I wanted to bring out because somebody had raised it before. They said they're getting some resistance from their municipalities because the template that they use is from Lexipol, which is, as many of you know, is a company that provides policy drafting services to police departments. Not always successfully. There's a case in the Northwest Washington or Oregon where a police department was sued because their policy was unconstitutional, and it was a Lexipol drafted policy, and the suit was successful. And I think, but I wonder if this is one of the concerns. I think is that, I mean, if you're a municipality, you don't have a lot of resources to have a lawyer go do deep digging on what's a good policy. So you use what's available. And if you have a template from DCJS or from Lexipol, that's very appealing. It gives you comfort. Other people are relying on it. You know, just like when I started teaching, I want to borrow syllabuses from other professors so I can, you know, hopefully not embarrass myself too much. So I'm curious about whether people have encountered this problem of template policies, and if so, whether there's any suggestions about how to manage that issue.
Ava from Saratoga Springs again. We've actually been working on our police department uses Lexipol policies, and we have been working on revising them. The fact that they come from Lexipol does not mean that they're set in stone. They can be revised, even though Lexipol has a copyright on the material. They do allow for local adaptation. So that's a real possibility.
Oh yeah, and just in case anybody's not clear, nobody can copyright your laws. There's no copyright. So once, and nor can they stop you for, they can't sue you to prevent you from stealing them either. So if you find a Lexipol policy online, I mean, I'm not offering this as legal advice, but if you like it and you want to use it, go ahead. They can't sue you. You're a legislator. There's no plagiarism. But that's a different story. That sort of, yes, you are certainly free. And if somebody thinks otherwise, oh my gosh, that would be incredibly unfortunate.
So I would just like to say that it's incredibly upsetting to know that the police do this as a template when, as advocates, the groups that I'm working with are just killing themselves doing research. And so, you know, yeah, there are lots of agencies out there for the police to take. I mean, if you look at all the policies that police have to deal with, right, it's a lot of stuff. So I get lifting, but when things are not working anymore and there's time for change, there's a lot of good policies out there that show really good statistics. Like if for use of force, for example, if you adopt sanctity of life statements in your policies, if you adopt a use of force continuum model, then almost immediately the use of force upon the ending of training comes down in those areas that have adopted even just those two pieces. There are components to the best case scenario in use of forces, like I said, the continuum. Training scenarios have to be real scenarios. It has to be role playing. It has to be specific training scenarios based on this is how we're training around a taser. This is how we're training around a baton. And all the different categories of use of force, not just lethal use of force. So those are some of the components that go into really good use of force policies. And I put in the chat before that Campaign Zero has a great model policy, and 8 Can't Wait has a great model policy. And there are, if you know, it's just, there's just real solid components of what go into a really good use of force policy that they're showing all around the country. These best practices are bringing down, literally bringing down use of force incidences. So I would encourage everybody to go to those resources.
Someone else points out in the, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So this is Vanessa again. Just piggybacking off of what the young lady said prior. I think when you talk about those role-playing scenarios, it's really important, as we were reviewing the training for the Suffolk County Police Department. Role-playing takes place, but it normally takes place with the training, the teachers and the police officers who are part of the training staff of the police department. So expanding that to include community members, to include our, members of community-based organizations, in addition to considering to work with a criminal justice class from our local college, will help for those real life scenarios to truly be real life, because now you'll be engaged with members of the community that you possibly will come in contact with and have to enact what you're being taught and the training that you're being taught. So just to take what she was saying a little bit further, we have, part of our recommendation and what there has been consensus building on is to expand the role playing and those who are part of role playing to actually have them really be community-based members.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on something in the chat. Somebody, and forgive me, it's W Cook 001 wrote, my understanding is that Lexipol sends out periodic updates which will obliterate your local adaptations. You must constantly review their updates to catch those occasions when you need to readapt their update. I find that very disturbing. If anybody is using Lexipol updates without reviewing them or without some independent local process for adapting them, I'm not anybody's lawyer here, but I would have real concerns about whether those things are in fact local policy and binding. But that's, I had no idea that Lexipol was, it sounds like capable of, I don't know, what is it, like the way your books automatically get updated when you subscribe to a statute?
No, it doesn't. The Lexipol can send to the police department,
right,
a recommended update, but it's the responsibility of the local department to decide what to adopt as policy. So the Lexipol can't simply force a new wording into a document.
Right. And I very much doubt that the state constitution would allow a local department to give away their, I shouldn't say I very much doubt. Who knows what the state constitution says? That thing is, but I'd be, it seems like there ought to be a law against delegating authority to an outside entity that way. And Shannon, thank you for noting in the comments, there's a use of force policy provided by the New York State Municipal Police Training Council. And Shannon says it's seriously lacking a focus on de-escalation and using least amount of force, and doesn't include threat of discipline or termination. I mean,
that's the policy that someone was referring to earlier that lots of municipalities are using as a model that they got from the state. I've seen police departments in Hudson Valley just direct copy word for word, but I have been able to have them make some adjustments to it.
Right, because that's an entity within the Division of Criminal Justice Services, right? The Municipal Police Training Council. That's what accredits police departments, which comes up a lot. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that this suggests to me is just a real resource need. So let me use this to segue sort of into the accountability and transparency conversation, because it all comes together. I mean, given that there are not only all these policies, but that they're being updated. And if you're a small municipality and you don't have the resources, to have consultants constantly on the lookout for new good practices, certainly there are nonprofit groups that you can reach out to for help, but somebody has to do the sifting through all of those recommendations, which I think ties back to our earlier conversation about the need for ongoing work on implementation of whatever recommendations come out of this 203 process, and the need for structures that we were talking about. So a couple of you asked about community civilian review boards and police discipline. So I was sort of putting this discussion off because everything comes crashing together um, around this. It's, this is where we get to police unions and where we get to ongoing structures and what's going to survive. Some, but not all, of New York State's larger municipalities have police review boards. The smallest one, thanks to my friends in Bethlehem, I was looking and discovered that Geneva has now proposed a police review board for a force that numbers in the 30s, which I think would be the smallest police review board in New York State. But most municipalities have other entities as well, including advisory boards that are supposed to recommend policy changes to the police. And certainly local legislatures have committees. And I know we have at least one distinguished council member from Albany here who has a long experience working with committees that develop real expertise on how that works. So there's various bodies that can structure all of that ongoing conversation. And I wonder if we could sort of talk a little bit about police review boards as a choice. I know this came up from a couple places. And Connor, I know you have a lot to say about both police review boards as an option and specifically the question that somebody asked. I swear I didn't ask them to set you up with this, but could somebody update us on how things are going with Rochester and the police discipline issue there? So do you want to, instead of opening the floor, I'll just invite you to start us off on that.
Sure, I'll answer that lingering question about what's the update. So there's a lawsuit between the Rochester's police union, the Locust Club, and the city over whether or not, specifically City Council, over whether or not the Police Accountability Board under New York State's labor law, the Taylor Law, can have the power to discipline officers. I'll note that pro bono counsel to our city council, Linda Kingsley, is here, and I think it would be remiss of me not to say that Rochester's blessed to have a city council that's willing to stand up and fight for its police accountability board. That's the only reason this case is being litigated, because we have a city council willing to do the right thing. The update is that the case is up in the appellate division. The union won at the lower court level to strip us of our disciplinary power. So that power is suspended now, but it's on appeal. And so we should be hearing sometime in the next month or so. Oral arguments were back in December. And I promise, regardless of what happens in that case, there will probably be an appeal to the Court of Appeals. So we probably won't have a full answer on this case, maybe till late summer. So that's the update on that. The thing I'll say, the professor and I have been engaged in this New York State Bar Association process regarding looking at civilian review boards as tools. I don't know if some of our other distinguished members are on this call. I think there are. I know Quatel was for a minute. But, we've taken a lot of testimony, looked at a ton of different institutions across the country, done a lot of learning. And our big lessons are this, is that, civilian review boards, you have to have, you can have really, I'd say, low goals of just, reviewing, a police department's input, a police department's discipline. You can have really high goals of controlling the police department's policies and practices, imposing discipline, this kind of stuff. And you have a lot of different models across the country. And, communities can can select really strong ones like Rochester's Police Accountability Board. And then there are some weaker examples across New York State. I'll say, regardless of the model that communities choose, perhaps the most important thing that people don't often talk about is funding. If you ask any executive director or leader of any police accountability board across the country, what they will say is, it doesn't matter what our legal powers have. If we don't have the resources, we can't do the job. We can't do the job without resources. It's the quiet, it's the dirty little secret of civilian review. And so all I would say is that I suppose the dirty little secret of this whole process is that it's all about money and funding. It's all about money for all these institutions, whether or not you're investing in alternative first responder models, if you're investing in civilian review boards, if you're even investing in different police training. You can have plans that include these things, but if you don't back it up with funding, it will fail, period. And so what I'll say is one of the comments that came up during Rochester's Executive Order 203 process, within the process, and again, these things weren't open to the public, but because the governor's order says these things need to be public, the deliberation to planning meetings, I feel entirely comfortable telling you what was discussed in our meetings, because I think the governor kind of requires it. So city officials came back in our meetings and said, the city's bankrupt. whenever there was a, not bankrupt literally, but saying, the city's facing an extreme financial crisis right now. How can this plan possibly request increases in funding to any department? And I think a lot of cities across New York State are facing that exact same problem. You want to reform the police? Where do you have the resources to do it? And I think having open discussions about that's important, because it's just truly not enough to pass plans that don't talk about funding at all. It's quite frankly irresponsible to tell the public that changes will happen without funding and implementation. So that's really my thought on civilian review boards. I know I went a little bit broader, Ava, but
well, let me ask you one follow-up question then, and then I'll open it up to anybody else who wants to as well. There's a distinction in terms of civilian review boards and their power. There's really sort of, and you've talked about this a lot, sort of two different levels of thing a civilian, like review of what, right? And one thing they can review is allegations of misconduct in individual cases. There's very troubling cell phone footage online. A complaint gets filed, the board investigates it, and maybe they take action on that individual case by, if they have the power, disciplining an officer or whatever else it is they do with that individual problem. But the other thing is reviewing policies and practices. And as with individual cases, there's a spectrum of power you can give a police review board, where they could have power to force new policies on the police department, to say, we don't like your, like Alice was saying, this chokehold policy doesn't make any sense. We've rewritten it. Now that's the chokehold policy. Right, we fixed it for you. Or it could be a more consultative role where they're involved. Many of these entities have only the power to make recommendations. But I wonder about, in terms of our earlier conversation, if you're thinking, look, we don't have a lot of resources in our municipality. There are a lot of places that have police review boards that do individual case review, that have frankly not earned a lot of community trust. I think as I've gone through this planning process in Albany, I've not heard a lot of people say they have a lot of trust in the Albany Community Police Review Board. And I think part of that is because it only makes recommendations mostly on individual cases, and people don't see how that contributes to improving things. I wonder, is it a good idea to say, like, let's actually focus more on bringing the community into policies? If we're thinking about setting up institutional structures for police reform, should we be, rather than saying, like, let's review allegations of individual misconduct, let's have a police review board that starts with looking at policies and really gives the community a voice on those going forward?
I'll briefly, should I answer?
Sure. Yeah. I was talking to you, but anybody can jump in. Then I'll just stop. I'll just stop.
What I'll say is, we're going to find out in Rochester. We don't currently have disciplinary power. We can't hold disciplinary hearings. We just can't do it, won't do it because of this lawsuit. We do still have the power to review RPD, Rochester Police Department, policies, practices, and procedures. And we don't just have the duty to do it, we have remarkable powers to get the job done. The transparency powers. When we ask for information, Rochester Police Department's got to provide it, right? That's a remarkable and rare power to give a civilian review board. And if you're focused just on officer discipline, you might not think about those powers. You might not think about that duty. But think about what a remarkable thing can be to have an agency focused on prying open what are often the most opaque institutions in local government and showing the community what actually goes on. What are the actual priorities? Are they actually creating public safety in your community? Right now, the Rochester Police Accountability Board is having its first oversight hearing into police department policies, practices, and procedures on Thursday. The police chief is coming before the Police Accountability Board answering a bunch of questions about their protest-related policies. I will say that's unprecedented in Rochester's history. City council has done a fantastic job over the last 50 years doing oversight, but they got to oversee all of city government. So to have an institution just focused on overseeing the Rochester Police Department, even if it can't discipline officers, can that create lasting and real change? We're going to see. We are really going to see. And so I hope people keep an eye on what we're doing in Rochester. But if anyone is thinking about building a civilian review board, I'm thinking about how to increase the efficacy of the civilian review boards you have, I would love to speak to you. And the last thing I'll say is I know we have a Rochester City Council member on this call, Mary Lupian, who has been a phenomenal ally of the Police Accountability Board. And there's nothing like having city council members and a city council as a whole that's in your corner. And so if there are other city council members in localities on this call, you have immense power to create change. And so whatever I can do to help you, please reach out and let me know.
All right, thanks. I see John DeVito has a hand up.
Hi, I'm John DeVito. I'm a member of LIFEPA in Nassau and Suffolk counties. We are actually proposing a CCRB, so I was finding this part of the conversation very useful. I follow the Rochester litigation. I know that the PBA in Rochester and maybe some other overarching PBAs are challenging it. Is that unavoidable? Is there a way to engage the PBA and as stakeholders to pass something or negotiate something to avoid that litigation? Do we even want that? And more broadly, I saw this point in the chat. How do we engage the PBAs in our municipalities to prevent everything we do from being litigated?
I feel like we'd be rich if we knew the answer. Almost every place that I've seen in the Hudson Valley that has a CRB has an effective CRB with discipline and subpoena powers, has run into obstacles and legal battles with PBAs. That's just my experience in the Hudson Valley.
I just want to say, Shannon's experience is universal. And the more powers a Police Accountability Board, the Civilian Review Board has, the more litigation it gets into with police unions. It's almost inevitable. Actually, I'm just going to say it's inevitable. And, in Rochester, we try and build open lines of communication with the police union, talk regularly, talk openly. But at the end of the day, the police unions have their job and civilian review boards have theirs. And, those commissions can be at cross purposes. And yeah, that's what I'll say.
Does anybody have thoughts? There's a question that's also come up. There's avoiding litigation, and obviously there's the ongoing challenge of trying to build towards buy-in from officers as opposed to the union to the greatest extent possible to whatever reforms one hopes to implement down the road. Does anybody have thoughts or experiences they would be willing to share in terms of what works well? I mean, I know these task forces have had a different variety of approaches on how the police are involved in involving line officers, and implementation down the road, I know is a concern that lots of people have, but does anybody have thoughts on that?
Ava, I'm sorry, was your question, how do we include police officers in this conversation? I'm sorry.
Yeah, or whatever else one does to try to get buy-in from police officers. Yeah.
In Bethlehem, they're sitting on the subcommittees with us. The chief of police is in the subcommittee on creating a community police review board. So she is right there sitting with us trying to create this. I'm not sure if I'm not sure if Annie's still on this call because she's on the subcommittee with me, but I'm not sure necessarily how supportive the chief is, but she's there at the conversation with us. And I'm not sure if other subcommittees are experiencing that same level of seemingly open collaboration.
There's a lot of opposition to it.
And again, I'm sorry,
groups. The fear was that people could not be open and honest, if fearful of retaliation. So it was a problem.
My experience is that you have to work with people, kind of like Alice was saying in a way that they can be somewhat anonymous, but yet get them involved in thinking through what has to be done to get what we want accomplished. And that becomes a start. And if you can then establish that a large percentage of your police force doesn't really want to defend the abuses. You have a way with group herd mentality, so to speak, of changing forces. But to do that, you really have to provide anonymous ways initially, and then try to get in touch with people and expand the discussion.
Sure. I think Chief McNally, I think.
Thank you, Ava. Good evening. I'm Chief Dan McNally. I'm with the Golden Police Department. 33 years as a police officer. My career has been kind of interesting. It started shortly before Rodney King, and now towards the end of mine, George Floyd. So I've got kind of an interesting background throughout, including a paramedic for a long time and our EMS director. So I wear some different hats. I also started our PBA when I was a young officer. So I'm very familiar with the union side and the administrative side. I am so optimistic right now for the opportunity for this change. I think there's many of us in the leadership roles as police chiefs that want this change. We don't condone the violence that's going on. Our new officers coming in are highly trained, highly educated, willing to make the changes. So again, I'm very optimistic that we can accomplish a lot here. But I think what we have to really focus on is where this really hits the street level. The police respond in that very emergent point of an incident. And we need the support around that. If we talk about mental health, whatever those issues are, we really need your help to come together. I've made myself available to our boards and anybody else that would like to speak about anything to do with policing. Defensive tactics is one of my strongholds. I'd be glad to talk to any of you individually about that. But again, I'm optimistic that together we can make this happen. I wish there was more chiefs of police on this call, because I see you as my colleagues and friends, and together, I think we can make some changes. Bethlehem, I'd love to work with you on any of your questions that you had over there as well. We have similar concerns and challenges. So again, I remain optimistic. I know I'm in upstate New York, so there's some different issues here. But again, thank you for allowing me to speak.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Does anybody else have more thoughts on police unions engaging with police officers? I do have one comment that came in the chat, which is to ask whether any municipalities are considering restrictions on campaign finance funding from police or police allies. This is something that I know has come up in some states. I think California has at least considered some restrictions on political relationships. Yeah, Susan, go ahead and share anything that you. I'm not sure if it's on this topic, but.
No, but that's why I was going to wait. I didn't want to
go ahead. I'm
change
sorry.
the subject.
So let me just stick there and open it up. Does anybody have thoughts on sort of more thoughts on engagement with officers or campaign restrictions or anything related to that?
Hello, how are you?
Hi.
I'm Risco Mention Lewis, Deputy Police Commissioner, Suffolk County Police Department, and Suffolk County. I've been on the call. Commissioner Hart, Commissioner of Police, our Chief of Department. We're on all the community forum calls.
Mhm.
We're on the task force. We're in all the subcommittees, every single one of them. We're probably in meetings 3, 4, 5 times a day with a different task force that we're subcommittees for the task force. So we're definitely committed, and the PBA is on the calls also. So we're very committed to listening, looking at the change, looking at the what people are presenting. I would say that we're not going to always agree on everything, obviously. I don't know if you can hear me. I hear sometimes I have a problem with I got a brand new laptop and it's terrible. But
You sound great. You sound great.
Okay, all right. And so we're committed to the change, and really committed to compromise, right? Because somebody might be far level 1 and somebody else may be far level 10, and it's coming up with the best things. You know, when people talk about the community, the review boards, right? I did my research. I ran around the country looking at all the review boards. I was open to it, looked at all the review boards. I looked at the cost of review boards, right? Anywhere from 5 million to 20 million. And then I looked at the characteristics of what's necessary for an effective review board. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't found one across the country that that people are saying is effective. Maybe I haven't found one, but I've done my research and I haven't found one. So I'm asking, even though people are asking for something, have they done the research to say, for $19 million, can you better spend it? Is there another model that we don't know about? Because like you said, yes, you need funding for the community review board. Yes, you need investigatory power, right? Yes, you need investigators. There's so many aspects that you need, including who appoints who's going to be on it. And so what I found it as a model, there are so many variables, and I haven't found a department yet, community review board, that can get all of the pieces that they claim are necessary for efficacy done. But even the ones you have, they're actually statistically more lenient than the police department themselves on their officers. That was the interesting thing. And so as we learn and we do our research, right, I'm on calls and people say, we hate implicit bias. You shouldn't have implicit bias training. It doesn't work. So again, we did our research on implicit bias training. And what I discovered was, when you talk about implicit bias, it depends on what you're trying to use it for, right? If you expect you're going to get implicit bias the next day and nobody's going to be biased, you're not going to be stopping people of color or whatever you're thinking, not going to happen. But it might open up people's understanding of their behaviors, that they do have bias. So it's very interesting. What I'm saying to you is we're all involved in all of our departments. We're on board, we're listening, we're learning, we're researching, getting some great ideas for our Suffolk County in particular. The research and data around mental health, addressing mental health issues, is really, really solid and good. And I think that I'd say out of all the categories, we probably made the most progress in coming up with some real solutions for that. So that's all. I think we're all committed. At least Suffolk County Police Departments, I think departments are committed. We're in all the calls, all the meetings, all the sessions, including this one. And I'm excited to see all of you on the call from across the state, coming up with new ideas. And I want to come on a call to see if there's something I hadn't heard, because I like to follow up on new information. So, because I love research. And so, I thank you for all your input. I really appreciate you all. That's all I wanted to say. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to jump in there? I mean, I will just say from our,
yes,
in all.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, William, please.
Hey, I just want to comment that I'm very thankful that Deputy Commissioner Minchin Lewis came on. Deputy County Exec Vanessa Bear Streeter, because they really summed up a lot of what I know is going on, and I couldn't put it in the right way in Suffolk County, that there's a lot of good things going on. We may have a ways to go, but there are good things happening. And the research portion of it is definitely a highlight for me from tonight. So I'm thankful and I'm hopeful that we continue to talk to each other. I also was appreciative of our 33-year, please forgive me that I didn't catch your name before you started talking, but the 33-year policeman that was on, and that was a well-rounded gentleman that gave different viewpoints from a different part of town, but very good viewpoints that I don't think we get that type of comments out in the public enough. We're in a terrible time right now with certain things, but we need to hear the good along with how we're trying to get solutions. So hearing good sometimes is very positive and very helpful.
Thank you. John DeVito, I see, has your hand up.
Hi, and thanks again for sharing some tips about how we're engaging maybe not just the union, but also regular police officers who may be all more receptive to what stakeholders are proposing. I do want to speak to Deputy Commissioner mentioned Lewis's point. She noted that in Suffolk County, the stakeholders and the department are engaged in a robust dialogue, and I see it. I witnessed that. But there's a distinction between the department and the PBA, and the PBA is conveying something different on their social media. They're conveying that they are not receptive to reform. They are conveying that their members should go and speak at town halls to not change the police department. Our police department is under attack. It's a lot harder to get through to the PBA, even though, I'm speaking personally, they are stakeholders. They have every right to be at the table, but it's hard to get through to them when they are not receptive in any way to any changes. And you did ask for some tips, and I know the chief also spoke, and I haven't quite gathered some great tips on how to engage the PBA, even though I think we want to.
Okay, thanks. Just one other thought about the cost, which I think is something that comes up all the time, and certainly it's something we're talking about in Albany as well. The budget for the Albany Police Review Board right now is about $270,000 a year. Now the Albany Police Department is about between 300 and 350 people in the department, and I think Suffolk is closer to 2,500. I think Suffolk PD is something in that order. So obviously you're talking about a much bigger entity. But I just to stress, I think the cost depends on what sorts of services the board provides, and there's a very different cost model for a board that reviews policy versus a board that does its own investigations and that imposes discipline. Certainly the Albany budget is relatively low currently because the board has a very limited investigative function. It doesn't have staff investigators. It uses independent consultants. But I also want to make sure to give folks a chance. So we're coming up now towards the end of the program. So, oh, and Susan, yeah, go right ahead.
I just want to be able to share this with everybody before we sign off. For any advocates that are proposing alternatives to policing as far as mental health, like crisis calls and crisis intervention, and just alternatives in general. And Shannon, I invite you to help me out here if it gets a little too weedy. I can't get too weedy because it's complicated and I don't quite have my head around it yet. But in the governor's budget proposal, there are some provisions around OMH and merging with OASIS, which is a substance abuse department. It's related to Medicaid, and the governor also has a provision in the budget to create Medicaid funded crisis stabilization centers in the counties. This can serve to block police reforms that might be proposed as far as alternatives such as cahoots and things like that, programs like that. So if you're one of the advocates that are proposing those kind of reforms, and as criminal justice advocates in general, talking about these kinds of alternatives, we need to be aware of this. It's in the budget bill. The budget is usually passed by April 1st. No coincidence. And I saw in the chat, somebody wrote April Fool's Day, which I'm just trying to avoid that thought at all costs. But I just wanted to make advocates aware of these provisions. I wish I can get a little more specific with you. It is very weedy. It was given to us by one of our really expert attorneys today. So I just want to put that on everybody's plate. If you're looking for alternatives to crisis calls, specifically for mental health. Shannon, how was that? Was that horrible?
No, I think you captured it, but I think that the missing point is that, so the governor has a proposal for addressing this that doesn't involve community engagement. And there's a law that could be passed called Daniel's Law that's coming out of the incident in Rochester with Daniel Prude that we feel really good about and have worked on drafting, that also addresses creating an alternative to the police to respond to mental health problems that has more community engagement. So I think the short takeaway is there's something in the governor's proposal that would do this, and then there's Daniel's law, and we think Daniel's law is a more effective method. Is that fair, Susan?
Yeah, except that we're proposing, Daniel's law is a statewide piece of legislation. If you're proposing at the local level alternatives to your police answering those calls, then it's about that as well. So just find out about it and make sure that people know about it. And if the governor is proposing this, my bigger question is, how dedicated are we really to police reform if you're putting something in the budget that is kind of in the weeds and not very transparent, that might actually block reforms. So yeah.
And William asks if maybe you could share the name of that proposal or put it in the chat again for people to try to find.
It's in the budget. I'll put the name of the centers in. I'll try to put something in for you.
The budget is terrifyingly hard to cite. Yeah,
yes,
it's very depressing. So let me just, there's one other thought I want to be sure to get to, because this came up at the very beginning of the program. And I do also, if folks have any sort of last issues they want to raise, that's welcome. But while you're thinking about that, the issue was, who pays when the police department gets sued? Does it come out of the police department's budget, or does it come out of the general municipal budget? And the thought is, maybe if the police department had to fund its own liabilities, it would create more of an incentive, that litigation would play more of an incentive. Let me just offer my perspective on this, because before I was a law professor, I worked for the state attorney general's office, where I defended state agencies, including some law enforcement agencies. And as it happens, some of those lawsuits, for very complicated reasons that I won't get into at the state level, sometimes it's the agency's budget that's on the line, and sometimes it's the state's budget that's on the line, the general state budget. And my experience dealing with those agencies, I know we have lots of other folks here who may have experience with this, and I'd be curious about your thoughts as well. My experience was, when the agency's own budget is on the line, they fight much harder and they're much more reluctant to settle. And there are cases where the interest that the plaintiff in the lawsuit has is really in getting money that they might be entitled to sooner rather than later. And the cases where I thought agencies fought too hard rather than offering a generous settlement were often the cases where it was the agency's own budget on the line. So I think there may be a dangerous consequence there. Will, I see your hand back up. Go ahead.
Yeah, since I had promulgated this question initially, the origin of the question goes back to a case a couple of years ago here in Albany, where a young man named Dante Ivy was shot in the back by the police. And the case was settled sometime afterwards for $165,000 or something like that. And I was shocked to discover that the charges were put on the general city budget. And it has been running around in my head ever since, that this gave the department no incentive whatever to change its behavior. If in that case, the costs were bonded. So in terms of the way the city states its budget, those costs were, that debt service was indistinguishable from the cost of building a park or repairing a street or anything else that's done with the city's budget. I'm told that the controller requires that bonded costs be on a general account and not be attributed to an agency. That absent a change on the controller's part, which I think ought to happen and which I understand there is some sentiment for within the controller's office, there's nothing that prevents the city or the city council from requiring that those costs be at least allocated or attributed to the agency which incurred them. And the thought here is that if the department understood the costs of its officers' misbehavior, there might be less such misbehavior. I understand the concern that you raised, and I guess that would be a countervailing consideration. But it seems to me that the alternative simply provides no incentive for the department to internalize the costs of even egregious kinds of cases. And it seems to me that you want to get the agency's buy-in. You want to get the police department's buy-in to at least eliminate some of the worst cases, the ones that are actually costing the city money. As a taxpayer, I'm really unhappy with the fact that in essence, I'm giving my police department an open checkbook for bad behavior.
Linda, I see you have your hand up.
Having spent a good part of my life as corporation counsel, first for Binghamton and then a dozen years in Rochester, I would agree with Ava that as attractive as it is to think about imposing it on the department, I can't imagine then being put in the position of having to get their buy-in to settle when their buy-in is almost never there and their gut is to fight no matter what. What we often did when I was corporation counsel, I'm no longer in that position now, I do it pro bono instead, is if we had to settle a large suit based on behavior of the department, the chief would often be required to provide to us how he was going to prevent this from happening again. What policy would he be putting in place? What new training practice would he be putting in place? While the other is appealing on a visceral level, I think the reality is if let's say you get $1 million verdict, well, you can't just knock out half of your police department as their penalty and to pay for it. But you can use that as a hammer on the department to get the chief to take some action to make some changes.
If the result of a large settlement, and I assume most of them are not enormous, is that you have to increase the budget of the police department, it seems to me to make that more publicly visible will increase the pressure for the police to make the reforms that otherwise are simply the subject of an internal discussion when the city is doing its budgeting. I think the more public that discussion is, the more likely you are to get change.
Could be, although keep in mind the bond discussion is public, and in the state we never had to have a public conversation about what our agencies did that was unlawful and violated people's rights.
That's because New York State is not particularly transparent in a lot of ways, and I say that as someone who worked in the state for a career.
Yeah, but the bonding process that you described, because it's not part of the ordinary budget, the bond.
But the debt service is.
Right.
All I'm suggesting is make the annual debt service a charge attributed to that agency.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so I want to make.
That's the argument.
Let me make sure because we're coming to the end. No, I appreciate. I think this has been great. It's been really useful. Are there any other issues folks want to air out before we whatever the opposite of convene is? Before I certify to the governor that this has been a great conversation. Is there anything else that folks want to raise? Anything we didn't get to? All right. Well, then let me just say thank you so much to everybody who participated in this conversation. If there's a way that I can be helpful, including connecting you to other participants, we do have sort of a video of this. I'm happy to try to connect folks to each other. Please do feel free to reach out, and thank you so much to everybody. This has been a really great experience for me. We're going to do another one of these for that's focusing specifically on rural communities a week from Thursday. And we also have the following Friday, we'll send out all this information, but there's a panel discussion on the 203 process where we're hoping to get a couple of folks from the governor's office to come and speak and maybe even answer some questions. So I'll send out all that information. In the meantime, I hope everybody has a great night. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing in your communities, whether you're part of the government or the police or the community itself. This is a really inspiring thing for me to get to observe and be part of. So thank you to all. And take good care. Be healthy.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Recording.